The Old Republic is a lot of people's favorite era in Star Wars, and almost nobody makes real content about it. The galaxy was trapped in a 24,000-year cycle of the same catastrophic wars, the same institutional failures, and the same personal collapses, long before Palpatine ever set foot in the Senate. And the characters who drove that cycle are more dramatically rich than almost anything in the broader Star Wars saga. Every major war in this era was started by one person making a choice. Naga Sadow decided an empire wasn't enough. Exar Kun decided rules applied to everyone except him. Ulic Qel-Droma decided he could survive darkness and remain himself. Mandalore the Ultimate decided a worthy war was worth any cost. Revan decided he'd seen something that obligated him to act in ways the galaxy wasn't ready to understand. The evidence starts in 6900 BBY. In 6900 BBY, the Battle of Corbos ended 100 years of civil war inside the Jedi Order. The conflict was called the 100-Year Darkness, and the name is literal, a schism that produced open warfare lasting a full century. The breakaway Jedi weren't power-hungry in a generic sense. They were practitioners of something specific, techniques that use the Force to warp and reshape living matter at the biological level. Creating creatures, altering species, building weapons from organic material through sheer force will. The Order considered these practices a fundamental corruption. The Renegades considered them a natural extension of what the Force could accomplish, techniques the Order was too rigid to explore and too afraid to permit. The war ended at Corbos with the Renegades defeated and the victorious Jedi Order facing a decision about what to do with several hundred trained Force users, each one skilled enough to have survived a century of active combat, each one committed enough to the dark side that reintegration wasn't a realistic option. The Order chose exile, stripped the Renegades of everything they could take, and pointed them into the unknown regions, with no destination and no expectation of contact. The man leading those exiles was a Jedi Master named Ajunta Pall. At Corbos, in the final battle, he'd personally killed more than a dozen Jedi. He wasn't a minor figure caught up in someone else's rebellion. He was the rebellion's most dangerous weapon, and the Jedi Order had just released him into deep space with several hundred fighters who shared his skills and his anger and his complete absence of remaining obligations to the Republic that had just defeated them. They found Korriban. The planet already had a civilization. The native Sith were a red-skinned, force-sensitive humanoid species with their own kings, their own spiritual traditions, their own hierarchy built across thousands of years of independent development. They had no framework for the kind of force manipulation the exiles carried. The biological alteration techniques the Order had spent a century trying to eradicate were genuinely new to everything on that world. Techniques that could reshape living matter, conjure creatures from nothing, bend the boundary between life and something else entirely. The native Sith had force sensitivity, but nothing like this. They were looking at a different order of capability. Ajunta Pall didn't conquer Korriban through a frontal assault. He studied the existing political structure and worked inside it. He found King Grouch's inner circle, the Shadow Hand, the king's most trusted advisors, and turned them. Grouch was betrayed by the people closest to him. Pall executed the king personally, using the king's own sword. The choice of weapon carried a message that needed no translation. He became the first Dark Lord of the Sith. What followed was nearly 2,000 years of something with no precedent in the galaxy's history. The exiled Dark Jedi and the native Sith species didn't remain separate. They intermingled across generations, culturally, philosophically, and eventually genetically. The force manipulation techniques the exiles had brought from their war against the Order merged with whatever force traditions the native Sith had already developed. Sith alchemy grew from that fusion. Not simply dark side combat technique, but an entire school of force application centered on alteration, creation, and domination of living matter. The empire that emerged over those 19 centuries wasn't a dark Jedi enclave in exile. It was a civilization. It had its own history, its own succession structures, its own architecture of tombs and temples built to last longer than the rulers inside them. Korriban's Valley of the Dark Lords filled slowly with the sarcophagi of successive rulers across centuries of internal war and expansion. The Republic's institutions didn't fail to monitor this empire out of negligence. The exile had been so total, the unknown regions so genuinely unmapped, that there was no reason to look. From the Jedi Order's perspective, the problem of the 100-year darkness had been solved at Corbos. The exile was the solution. In that assumption, that banishment was permanent, that what couldn't be seen couldn't return, the next 2,000 years of war were being quietly loaded. By 5000 BBY, Korriban's Valley already held a dozen successive rulers in stone, and the Sith Empire had absorbed tributary systems and accumulated the kind of institutional history that makes a civilization feel permanent. The current Dark Lord had just died, and two men were positioned to determine what came next. Ludo Kresh represented the cautious argument. His position was strategic rather than timid. The Republic was enormous, well-established, and connected to a Jedi Order whose capabilities the Sith had never actually tested at full scale. 2,000 years of building what existed on Korriban was worth protecting. Containment, consolidation, patience. His opponent was Naga Sadow. Sadow was a master Sith alchemist, one of the most technically accomplished practitioners the Empire had produced, and he was constitutionally incapable of containment. He believed the Sith Empire had grown powerful enough to consume the Republic outright. He believed Kresh's caution was cowardice dressed as strategy. He had been waiting for a pretext, the way a certain kind of ambitious man always has a pretext ready, when one arrived from the entirely wrong direction. Two Republic merchants, siblings named Gav and Jory Daragon, were running hyperspace routes in the Outer Rim when their navigation failed catastrophically. Their emergency jump dropped them directly into Sith space. They had no intelligence value. They weren't scouts or military operatives. They were traders who had gotten catastrophically lost, and their arrival threw the entire succession question into immediate crisis. Kresh's position was straightforward: execute them. Their presence was a security breach, and silence was the only safe response. Sadow read the situation entirely differently. The Daragon siblings were worthless as prisoners. As instruments, they were invaluable. He appears to have staged an attack on his own meditation sphere, then attributed it to a Republic rescue operation attempting to extract the captives. The manufactured incident gave him a political argument. Republic agents had already penetrated Sith space. Kresh's isolationism was already irrelevant. War was inevitable regardless of what the Sith chose to do. He freed Gav Daragon, cultivated him as a personal ally, and sent Jory Daragon back to Republic space with a tracking device concealed on her ship. Jory didn't know she was carrying a beacon. She believed she'd escaped. She was drawing a hyperspace corridor from Sith territory directly to the Republic's heart, and Sadow followed it. The Great Hyperspace War began with the Republic genuinely unprepared. No intelligence existed on Sith military capabilities because for 2,000 years, the Sith Empire hadn't appeared on any Republic chart. Sadow's opening assault hit multiple fronts simultaneously, combining real military force with his signature tactical approach. Using his meditation sphere to project phantom armies across the battlefield, generating the appearance of forces far larger than his actual deployment. The Republic was fighting both a real enemy and an illusion of one, and the two were indistinguishable from inside the engagement. Then, Gav Daragon watched the destruction and understood, too late, what his alliance with Sadow had actually produced. Cities burning on worlds he'd been promised were targets of liberation rather than conquest. He had been useful and was now discarded. He sabotaged the meditation sphere from inside the Sith lines, collapsing the phantom projections. The real scale of Sadow's forces became visible. The Republic counterattacked with everything it had. Sadow's fleet broke and retreated towards Sith space. Waiting there was Ludo Kresh. Still alive, having survived the war Sadow had launched over his explicit objections, with a fleet positioned for ambush. Sadow had outmaneuvered Kresh politically to start the war. Kresh had simply waited for the consequences to arrive. Sadow escaped with a remnant of Massassi warriors and fled to Yavin 4, where he spent his remaining years in extended stasis, a Dark Lord with a destroyed empire and nowhere to return to. The Republic counterattacked into Sith space, and the civilization that had taken 2,000 years to build was obliterated in the aftermath. Survivors fled deeper into the unknown regions. They would eventually reconstitute under a different ruler. That process took 1,000 years, and what emerged from it was something categorically more patient and more dangerous than anything Sadow had built. The Great Hyperspace War established, in 5000 BBY, the structural pattern at the center of this entire era. The Sith's most reliable enemy wasn't the Jedi or the Republic. It was the interior logic of Sith ambition. Kresh's caution would have preserved the Empire indefinitely. Sadow's hunger burned it for a single campaign. 1,000 years passed. The Republic rebuilt. The Jedi Order reconstituted its numbers and returned to the business of peacekeeping across an era that looked, from the inside, like stability. The connecting thread to the next catastrophe is a Jedi named Freedon Nad. Around 4000 BBY, he fell to the dark side, apprenticed himself to a surviving Sith Lord, and used what he'd learned to conquer Onderon through Force dominance alone. He died, but he built something that outlasted him. His tomb became a focal point of dark side energy so concentrated that it functioned across generations as a beacon for any Force-sensitive drawn toward forbidden knowledge. His spirit persisted inside that darkness, teaching and tempting the vulnerable, more dangerous dead than he'd ever been alive. He made himself architecturally useful to the next catastrophe. Nad's specific legacy was Exar Kun. Exar Kun was a Jedi Knight with a master named Vodo Siosk Bas, a Drathos scholar, a keeper of ancient lore, a teacher of considerable reputation within the Order. By every available measure, Kun was exceptional, physically formidable, intellectually aggressive, impatient with the Jedi Order's deliberate pace in ways that read less like arrogance than genuine frustration with constraints that seemed designed to limit talent rather than develop it. The specific incident that began Kun's departure was a Sith holocron in Bas's possession. Ancient, dangerous, holding knowledge that predated the Jedi Order's current institutional form. When Kun attempted to access it, Bas stopped him directly and explicitly. This knowledge was reserved for Jedi Masters. Kun wasn't yet a master, regardless of his demonstrated capabilities, and the prohibition stood. This is the kind of moment that a person can absorb as guidance or experience as injustice. Kun experienced it as injustice. He had built his entire self-understanding around the evidence of his own exceptional abilities. A rule that prevented him from accessing something he was demonstrably capable of using was, by his logic, a rule designed by people less capable than him to protect themselves from being surpassed. That reading was wrong. It was also internally consistent with everything Kun had been told about himself for years, which made it much harder to recognize as wrong from the inside. He left the Order and went looking for what it wouldn't provide. His trail moved through the accumulated dark side history Freedon Nad had left behind, through Onderon's system, through scattered Sith repositories on the Outer Rim, each fragment of forbidden lore pointing further toward original sources. Toward Yavin 4, toward the massive stone pyramids Naga Sadow's ancient Massassi servants had constructed there 15 centuries earlier. Those temples rose above the jungle canopy, like structures designed to outlast every civilization surrounding them, the stone blocks fitted with a precision that spoke to construction methods involving more than ordinary engineering. The dark side concentration inside them registered like pressure in the chest of anyone force-sensitive enough to feel it, not metaphorically, but as a physical quality of the air in those corridors, something heavier than atmosphere. Kun reached the temples. His descent to Yavin 4's surface went catastrophically wrong. His transport damaged, his body failing from the injuries sustained in the wreck, dying alone in thick jungle heat with no communication and no rescue coming. The dark side in those stones had been waiting since Sadow's era for someone worth reaching. Freedon Nad's spirit appeared in the dim interior of the temple, in the specific condition, desperate, injured, cut off, where survival and the dark side looked like the same offer. What Nad offered was continuation, dark side knowledge vast enough to heal what the crash had broken, to restore Kun's connection to the Force, to give him everything he'd come to these temples to find. The price was obvious. Kun had spent his adult life certain he was exceptional enough to handle whatever the dark side presented, certain that the Order's prohibitions reflected institutional timidity rather than genuine wisdom. And here was the direct test of that certainty. He accepted Nad's guidance. He went through the temple archives. He absorbed what they contained. Then, once Nad had served his purpose, Kun destroyed the spirit with a dark side amulet. The teacher became a resource to be consumed and discarded the moment the teacher became an obstacle. That action, the willingness to use and eliminate even a mentor once the mentor stopped being useful, was diagnostic. Exar Kun's version of the dark side wasn't the passionate surrender that usually drives Force sensitives toward it. He was methodical, cold. He was applying the Order's own emphasis on rigorous study and disciplined mastery to a completely different end. He invented the double-bladed lightsaber configuration during this period, redesigning the fundamental weapon of the Jedi tradition to make it more lethal in the hands of someone trained to exploit the second blade's attack angles. He located and studied Sith artifacts with the systematic focus of a researcher building a reference library, then developed techniques to use those artifacts to corrupt other Jedi, deploying the methods against the institution that had produced him. On Ossus, the Jedi fortress world holding the largest surviving repository of ancient knowledge, he killed Odan-Ur, the elderly Jedi keeper of antiquities, and took a Sith holocron the Order had spent generations protecting. Odan-Ur had devoted his life to preserving that knowledge. Kun killed him for it, and walked out with what he'd come for. Each of those actions was a choice, not a compulsion. The dark side's seductive promise is typically described in terms of power offered to the weak or the desperate. Kun's version was colder than that. He wasn't weak and he wasn't desperate. He was brilliant, disciplined, and entirely certain that every institution which had ever tried to limit him had been wrong. He was accumulating evidence. At Ulic Qel-Droma's trial on Coruscant in 3996 BBY, Kun arrived to end the proceedings by killing Vodosiask Bas in open court. The master who had forbidden him access to a holocron, who had been correct about the consequences of that prohibition being ignored, died for being correct. The ghost of Marka Ragnos, an ancient Sith lord whose spirit had apparently been waiting centuries for someone adequate, appeared during the confrontation and christened Kun the new Dark Lord of the Sith. The recognition Kun had believed himself owed since the day Bas sent him out of the room arrived, finally, in the form of a ghost speaking over his master's body. The great Sith war that followed was specifically and personally Exar Kun's war against every institution that had ever presumed to limit him. He didn't fight it alone. Ulic Qel-Droma was a Jedi Knight from Alderaan, trained by a master named Jeth, with a reputation built entirely on loyalty, the willingness to place himself between danger and the people he cared about. He developed a deep relationship with a Jedi named Nomi Sunrider during a campaign on Onderon. His brother Kay had fought at his side through every significant engagement. He was the kind of person around whom other people organized their sense of safety, and he knew it, and he took that responsibility seriously. When a dark side cult called the Krath began systematically assassinating Jedi, and killed Ulic's own master in the process, Ulic did something nobody asked of him. He proposed an undercover infiltration. Find the Krath's leadership. Earn their trust through performance, convincing enough to reach the center of the organization. Dismantle it from within, before it could consolidate into a genuine military threat. His grief for his master was real. His logic was coherent. His confidence in his own ability to maintain his identity through sustained exposure to a dark side environment was, in retrospect, the most dangerous quality he had. The Krath operated from the Empress Teta system, built around its surviving leadership, most significantly, a woman named Alima Keto. Keto was a practitioner deeply embedded in the dark side techniques the Krath had developed, and her relationship with Ulic operated on several levels simultaneously: political, personal, and as a sustained piece of dark side influence applied with patient consistency over months and then years. She wasn't simply corrupting Ulic through external pressure. She was creating conditions in which his existing qualities, his capacity for loyalty, his willingness to commit fully to whatever he was doing, bent toward darkness rather than light. The thing about performing darkness convincingly enough to fool people who live inside it's that every performance is practice, and sustained practice changes the practitioner. The cover identity starts to occupy the same space as the original, not through a single dramatic choice, but through accumulated erosion. The day-by-day calcification of behaviors practiced so long they stop requiring conscious effort. Ulic's mission required him to be Krath convincingly enough to reach their leadership. He was doing it every day. At some point, the distance between the performance and the person performing it collapsed. The Jedi Council grew concerned enough to attempt reaching him. Ulic refused contact. He was close. He was making progress. The specific logic of "give me more time, I can still do this," is exactly how an undercover operative remains inside a dark side cult 6 months longer than intended, then 12, then indefinitely. At some point, the mission rationale becomes the rationalization for staying, rather than the reason for staying. The two feel identical from the inside. By the time Ulic surfaced visibly, standing beside Exar Kun at Coruscant, walking away from the Republic's jurisdiction after Kun killed Voto Siosk Boss in open court, he wasn't performing anymore. The man who had volunteered for the Krath infiltration out of grief for his master and certainty in his own durability had become exactly what he'd volunteered to destroy. The Great Sith War played across multiple systems and several years, with Kun directing military campaigns and cultural destruction he'd been building toward since Yavin 4. The assault on Ossus, the Jedi fortress world holding the galaxy's largest surviving repository of ancient knowledge, combined Kun's strike on the Archive with Ulic's ground campaign, and brought both Sith Lords together at the location that mattered most to everything the Jedi Order was trying to preserve. On Ossus, Ulic Qel-Droma killed his brother Kay. The sequence matters. Kay Qel-Droma had been with Ulic from the beginning. He'd fought beside him on Onderon, watched him volunteer for the Krath mission, waited through years of silence when the Council's contact attempts failed. On Ossus, they found each other on opposite sides of an active engagement, and the fight between them ended with Kay dead on the ground and Ulic standing over him in front of every Jedi who had known them both. Whatever Ulic Qel-Droma felt in that moment, and the accounts describe someone who had just broken through to a recognition he'd been avoiding for years, it registered on his face and in his stillness, in a way that the people watching couldn't miss. The specific grief of having killed your own brother in front of the people who loved you both, after years of choices you justified to yourself as necessary, is the kind of event that cuts through whatever psychological architecture you've built to explain yourself. Nomi Sunrider had loved Ulic Qel-Droma. She'd fought beside him on Onderon, watched him enter the Krath, tried through every available channel to pull him back across the years of his mission. She wasn't a council member. There was no authorizing body whose sanction she had for what she did next. She built a wall between Ulic and the Force, severed his connection entirely, used her own ability in a way that had no formal precedent, and left him without the power that had structured his entire existence. Utterly defeated, the accounts say, and mortified. An action that could be read as punishment and could be read as mercy, performed by the one person whose judgment about Ulic Qel-Droma couldn't be dismissed as institutional. Ulic then gave the Jedi Exar Kun's location, his partner in everything since Coruscant. He told them where Kun was hiding. Republic and Jedi forces surrounded Exar Kun's temple complex on Yavin 4. His army broken, his locations exposed, Ulic's defection having stripped away the operational cover he'd relied on, Kun performed a ritual inside the pyramid, using his Massassi followers as both audience and fuel. He drew on their life energy through force techniques, refined from whatever dark traditions Naga Sadow's ancient servants had embedded in those stones, and he bound his spirit to the temple structure. His physical body died. His essence persisted in the stone for thousands of years, dormant, coherent, waiting. The man who had spent his adult life arguing that no institution had the right to limit access to knowledge ended his physical existence by deciding that the people who'd followed him across the galaxy were worth less than his own continued presence. His Massassi weren't consulted. His final act confirmed, in the plainest possible terms, the thing the Jedi Order's prohibition had been trying to prevent. Exar Kun had always believed his existence was worth more than other people's. Ulic Qel-Droma spent the next decade on Ren Var, an ice planet, remote, watched by nobody. Without the Force. Without K. Without the Jedi identity that had organized his sense of self since childhood. Whatever version of himself remained after Ossus, he lived with it in isolation until 3986 BBY, when a Cathar warrior killed him there. He died on a frozen world in the middle of nothing, 10 years after the war he'd helped build had ended. The Great Sith War was over. The Jedi had won. The structural conditions that had produced both Kun and Qel-Droma, the Order's gatekeeping that drove exceptional practitioners toward forbidden knowledge, the heroic ethos that sent gifted Jedi on impossible undercover missions with insufficient support, were completely intact. The institutions exhaled. 20 years later, the Mandalorians came. Mandalore the Ultimate had spent years rebuilding Mandalorian culture after the Great Sith War's devastation into the Neo-Crusaders, a unified warrior identity built around a specific philosophical purpose. He wanted a worthy war. The distinction matters in Mandalorian terms. Resources and territory were secondary. What Mandalore was pursuing was a genuine test against the most formidable opposition available. The Galactic Republic was the largest and most powerful civilization in the galaxy, which made it, by the internal logic of Mandalorian philosophy, the only opponent whose defeat would mean anything at all. The campaign began in 3976 BBY at the galaxy's outer edges, fringe worlds the Republic Senate would struggle to justify spending political capital to defend. Mandalore was running a deliberate stress test on Republic political will. Attack worlds just marginal enough that non-intervention remained defensible, then move inward. Watch exactly where the Republic's commitment to its members actually began. Cathar was among the early systems struck, a massacre significant enough that it would later become the specific event that converted a Jedi's internal conflict into irreversible commitment to the war. The Republic Senate initially failed to respond, declining to commit resources to a conflict at the galaxy's margins. The Jedi Council held back as well. Their position wasn't simple cowardice. It was a genuine philosophical argument that the Jedi existed to serve the Force rather than to function as the Republic's permanent military, and that entering a war without full strategic understanding was reckless. This reasoning sounds defensible when stated in the abstract. Measured against 16 years of burning frontier worlds and no meaningful institutional response, it sounds different. There is evidence from Sumptor-era records that Mandalore the Ultimate had received dark side influence before launching the Crusade, that some Sith actor pointed him at the Republic with specific intent. His motivations appeared genuinely coherent within Mandalorian philosophy regardless. The worthy war framework tracks with everything his culture valued, and a man who already wanted a reason didn't need much manufacturing. If the manipulation occurred, it found a willing instrument. It also meant the Mandalorian Wars may have been the opening move in a game being played by a power neither the Republic nor the Jedi could see. A patient Sith hand, using Mandalorian ambition as an instrument, watching the Republic bleed and measuring what broke. A Jedi named Revan was watching while the Council deliberated. He had trained through the Order, absorbed its values, but developed a specific and increasingly impatient orientation toward action that kept colliding with institutional caution. He went to Cathar. He stood in what the Mandalorian campaign had left there. In 3976 BBY, Revan defied the Council's position, and led a coalition of Jedi into the war, taking his closest friend and most trusted lieutenant, a man named Malak, with him. 16 years of war followed. Revan won it. At Malachor V, in 3960 BBY, Revan killed Mandalore the Ultimate in single combat. In his final moments, Mandalore reportedly revealed what the Cathar ruins had implied. Sith interests had been behind the Crusade's launch. That everything Revan had fought for 16 years had been, at some level, arranged by an enemy he hadn't yet identified. Revan didn't return to the Republic as its greatest military hero. He took his fleet into the unknown regions to find the source. To understand what he found, you need to know what the Great Hyperspace War had actually produced 1,000 years earlier. When Naga Sadow's campaign collapsed in 5000 BBY, the Sith Empire shattered but didn't extinguish. Survivors fled deep into unmapped space. Over the following centuries, those survivors reconstituted under a ruler fundamentally different from anything the Sith succession had previously generated. A Sith emperor named Vitiate, also known as Tenebrae, who had extended his own life across millennia through ritual and built a completely new empire beyond the Republic's reach. Vitiate's empire wasn't Sadow's empire rebuilt. It had been developing in the dark, patient and invisible, for 1,000 years. It had military infrastructure. It had technology. It had a ruler who had been planning its eventual emergence since before Exar Kun was born, and who had demonstrated his particular brand of capability by draining the entire population of a planet to sustain his own existence. Nathema, the world where Vitiate first conducted that ritual, was a dead place, stripped of all life, a monument to what the reconstituted Sith Empire's leadership was actually capable of. Revan found it. Found Vitiate on Dromund Kaas, the hidden capital deep in the unknown regions. Stood in front of 1,000-year-old strategic intelligence, operating at a scale that made the Mandalorian Wars look like a border skirmish. What that confrontation actually did to Revan is the most contested question in his entire arc. One account, preserved through Kreia, the morally complex philosopher encountered years later in KOTOR II, holds that Revan saw the true Sith Empire clearly and made a deliberate strategic calculation. The Republic in its current form couldn't survive contact with what Vitiate was building. It needed to be hardened, forged by war into something capable of lasting the confrontation. Revan chose the dark side as a strategic instrument, built a Sith Empire of his own as controlled opposition, and used it to militarize the Republic by giving it an enemy it had to defeat or die. The flaw in that reasoning, assuming the Republic could be force-evolved into adequate capability without destroying what made it worth preserving, was catastrophic enough that the plan killed billions, regardless of the intent behind it. Store-era lore complicates this further. Vitiate's direct confrontation with Revan may have broken him in ways that made the turn less a clean strategic choice and more the consequence of the Emperor's direct manipulation of a mind already strained by 16 years of total war and the weight of what those 16 years had cost. Both accounts agree on what Revan and Malak looked like when they emerged from the unknown regions. Darth Revan and Darth Malak, Sith Lords, with a fleet that moved through Republic systems like something that had been designed specifically to defeat the defenses those systems actually had. The instrument of that fleet was the Starforge, the Rakata, an ancient species that had dominated the galaxy millennia before the Republic existed, calling themselves the Infinite Empire, built the Starforge as a weapons factory, powered not by conventional fuel, but by the dark side of the Force itself. Feed it dark side energy from a Force-sensitive operator, and it produced warships continuously, indefinitely, without resource constraints. No supply lines, no manufacturing bottlenecks, no limit on the fleet it could generate, except the amount of dark side energy flowing through whoever maintained contact with it. The Rakata had used the Starforge to sustain their galactic dominance for generations. The factory had also contributed to their eventual collapse. The dark side energy it processed fed back into everyone who relied on it, accelerating corruption from the inside out at a rate that eventually made the Rakata who depended on the station something less than functional. They had used the most powerful weapon in the galaxy, until the weapon made them incapable of using anything else. The Infinite Empire rotted from inside the Starforge's output, and the ancient Rakuten Prime system still held the evidence when Revan found it thousands of years later. Revan used the Starforge anyway. Warship after warship, the factory's outputs flowing into a conquest fleet, operating under Darth Revan's strategic direction, the campaign moving against the Republic with a methodical efficiency that looked nothing like the chaos of the Mandalorian Wars, and everything like someone who understood the Republic's defensive architecture from the inside. Whether the Starforge's ambient corruption was eroding Revan's original strategic calculations as the campaign progressed, or whether conquest had been the plan all along, the outcome was identical from the Republic's perspective. The man who had saved them from the Mandalorians had returned to finish what the Mandalorians started. Then Malak fired on his own master's ship. In 3956 BBY, during a Republic ambush of Revan's fleet, Darth Malak ordered his gun batteries turned on Revan's flagship. Malak had been Revan's closest friend, the man who had fought beside him through the entire Mandalorian Wars and walked with him into the unknown regions, who had shared whatever transformative experience Dromund Kaas had produced, who had been, for 16 years of genuine war, the one person Revan trusted completely. Malak calculated that killing Revan was the most efficient path to sole command of the Starforge and everything it was building. A Jedi named Bastila Shan was with the Republic forces in that engagement. She possessed an ability called battle meditation, the capacity to amplify the morale and tactical coordination of an entire fleet through the Force, which made her one of the most strategically valuable Jedi the Order could deploy. She boarded Revan's flagship during the chaos of Malak's strike, found him dying, and a Force bond formed between them in that moment. The kind of deep, involuntary connection that sometimes develops between Force sensitives under extreme circumstances, that preserved Revan's life when nothing else could have. The Jedi Council, presented with Darth Revan critically wounded and accessible for the first time since his fall, made a calculated decision. They didn't execute him. They couldn't afford to. The Starforge was still operational. Darth Malak was still building the conquest fleet, and Revan's mind still held the Starforge's exact location, buried somewhere in the subconscious that Malak's betrayal had shattered. The only viable path to the Starforge ran through whatever Revan could be made to remember. So the Council wiped his memory, constructed a new identity for him, placed him on a ship with Bastila Shan, and waited to see if the pieces of who he'd been would lead them where they needed to go. Revan spent the following years without his name, without his history, without any coherent understanding of what he'd done. Moving through the galaxy with Bastila, the Force bond between them pulling the journey forward, toward places he'd been, people he'd affected, coordinates that triggered recognition in a mind that no longer had the context to explain why. He was following a trail he'd laid himself, toward a confrontation with a man who had been his closest friend. The confrontation came at the Starforge. Revan destroyed Darth Malak and brought the Rakuten factory down. The fleet it had built was broken. The conquest ended. Revan's war didn't. According to SWTOR-era records, Revan eventually recovered the memories the Jedi Council had buried, the full weight of what he'd seen on Dromund Kaas, what Vitiate was building, what Mandalore had revealed in his final moments on Malachor V. He returned to confront the Sith Emperor directly. That confrontation, documented across the Old Republic MMO's Shadow of Revan expansion, ends without the clean resolution the Starforge had provided. Vitiate had been building towards something on a scale that dwarfed every previous conflict this era had produced, and Revan's final confrontation with him left no clear victor and no closed account. The man who had spent his adult life responding to the same enemy from multiple directions died still fighting the root cause. That incompleteness is appropriate. Revan had seen the cycle from every position it offered. Jedi hero, Sith conqueror, amnesiac instrument of Republic strategy, and finally, the one person in the galaxy who understood precisely why the cycle kept running and found it impossible to stop. There is no clean ending for a character whose entire arc was built around a question that doesn't have one. Revan is the most morally complex figure this era produced. Not because his arc is the largest, but because the choice at its center is the most uncomfortable. Most Star Wars falls involve passion overwhelming reason, grief reshaping judgment, fear driving terrible decisions, love twisted into something that destroys what it claimed to protect. Ulic Qel-Droma fell, trying to protect people, and was consumed by the darkness he was trying to fight. A tragedy built on good intentions, without adequate architecture for sustaining them. Exar Kun fell because he genuinely believed he was exceptional enough to be beyond the Order's limitations. A tragedy built on arrogance that happened to be partly accurate. Revan fell, at least in part, because he was right about something real. The Sith Empire beyond known space existed. It was the scale he described. The Republic in its current form wasn't remotely prepared for contact with what Vitiate had spent 1,000 years building. His strategic assessment was more accurate than the Jedi Council's comfortable assumption that the known galaxy's dangers were manageable. Being right still produced the Jedi Civil War. Correct strategic intelligence, acted upon with total conviction, became indistinguishable in its consequences from the thing it was trying to prevent. That story isn't about a villain making a villainous choice. It's about the limits of what correctness can accomplish when the cost of acting on it destroys what was worth protecting. The 24,000-year cycle this era spans is a documented sequence with specific dates. In 6,900 BBY, Jedi are exiled and found the Sith Empire on Korriban. By 5,000 BBY, that empire is large enough to launch a galactic war, led by a man whose personal ambition destroys it from within before the Republic can fully mobilize. The Republic wins. The institutions exhale. Around 4,000 BBY, a Jedi falls to dark side knowledge he wasn't permitted to access, builds a Sith power base from scratch, and comes closer to destroying the Order than any external military had managed, partly enabled by another Jedi trying to fight darkness from the inside with no adequate support for what that mission actually required. The Republic wins. The institutions exhale. By 3,976 BBY, a Mandalorian crusader is running a 16-year stress test on Republic political will, apparently guided by a Sith hand that neither the Republic nor the Jedi Council can identify, while institutional caution creates the conditions for the most capable Jedi of the era to defect from the Council's position to fight a war it wouldn't engage. The Republic wins. The institutions exhale. The man who won that war returns as its greatest threat, because what he found at the edge of known space revealed that the exhausted institutions weren't remotely adequate to what was coming. 4 catastrophes. 4 characters whose choices were each, in their specific way, defensible by some framework available to them at the time. 4 galaxy-wide consequences that nobody fully intended and nobody could fully reverse. The Jedi Order's response to Exar Kun was to be more careful about corruption risks, without examining why a student of Kun's caliber had experienced the Order's prohibitions as injustice rather than guidance, and whether the architecture of those prohibitions was itself producing the pressure it was meant to prevent. The Republic Senate's response to the Mandalorian Wars was to be grateful someone had fought them, without examining why 16 years of frontier attacks had generated 0 effective Senate mobilization, and what that paralysis revealed about the Senate's capacity to respond to a patient enough strategic threat. The Jedi Council's response to Revan was to wipe his memory and use him as a navigation instrument, without examining what specific experience in the unknown regions had convinced one of their finest Jedi that the galaxy's institutions were so inadequate they needed to be replaced by force, and whether that assessment had any accuracy worth engaging. Each institution learned something from each catastrophe. Never quite the right thing. The cycle's engine was the gap between the lesson taken and the lesson that was available. Ajunta Pal's Force Ghost was still present on Korriban when Revan arrived there, in the Valley of the Dark Lords, where the Sith Empire's successive rulers were entombed across 5,000 years of history. The first Dark Lord of the Sith, the Jedi Master who had started this entire chain, found something like peace in that encounter. Millennia of warfare had passed. The empire he'd built on Korriban had collapsed and rebuilt and collapsed again. The wars he'd seeded with that original landing had killed billions of people across dozens of worlds, across thousands of years. And in the place where his exile had first taken root, in the valley of every consequence his choice had eventually produced, his ghost found a moment of genuine resolution. That detail, the original Dark Lord at rest, encountered by the most recent one, carries the weight this era's storytellers understood they were working with. The Tales of the Jedi comics and Knights of the Old Republic were built by people who grasped that the Old Republic's real subject was the galaxy's inability to learn from its own history at the institutional level. Individual characters could learn. Ajunta Pall's ghost learned. Ulic Qel-Droma learned, at catastrophic personal cost, during 10 years on a frozen planet no one was watching. Revan learned, and relearned, and kept learning as the thing he was trying to prevent kept reforming beyond his reach. The institutions didn't learn. The Republic kept producing conditions for Sith empires by never addressing why Jedi fell in the first place. The Jedi Order kept applying prohibitions that drove exceptional practitioners toward exactly the forbidden knowledge the prohibitions were designed to prevent access to. The Sith kept rebuilding because Republic victories never closed the pathway from fallen Jedi to Dark Empire. The pathway Ajunta Pall first walked in 6900 BBY. By the time Palpatine was maneuvering in the Senate 2,000 years later, he wasn't introducing a new kind of failure to the galaxy. He was exploiting structural weaknesses that had been present since the first exiled Dark Jedi landed on Korriban. The Galactic Empire wasn't an aberration. It was the 24,000th year of the same argument. Almost nobody makes real content about this era. Now you know why they should. Subscribe. There's significantly more of this where it came from.